welcome everyone. I'm excited that people are interested to learn about phenology. I think I'll unplug that and close the doors. Sorry, technical issues. So yeah, let's jump right into learning about phenology. There we go. So what is phenology? Well, if you paid up today for a talk about phrenology, which would be the bumps on the science of the bumps on your head, kind of pseudoscience, then I'm afraid you wasted your $15. But because we're going to be talking about phenology, which is nature's clock, which is the science of the time of ecological events through the year. And each of those different events is called a phenophase. So examples of phenophases would be bud burst, seed development, reproduction in mammals. Okay, so these are all different ecological events. And today we're going to be looking at changes that are happening in our area to these events. So phenophases are controlled by different cues that animals receive from their environment and plants. And the main cues are day length, temperature, snow melt, and winter temperatures, and then particularly in the desert Southwest, which we won't really talk about today, it tends to be based around rainfall. So in different parts of the country, you definitely see different responses because cues are different. And why we're interested in this and why we're talking about it today is because of the impact that humans are now having on these cues. Because climate change is actually changing the cues, and so changing the phenophases that we see, the timing of them through the year. We might be thinking, well, why is this important? Why are we interested in learning about phenology? Well, one of the most reasons I really like about phenology is it really encourages you to closely observe nature around you. So it's really just great. Since I've been doing phenology, it's made me a much better naturalist. I pay attention when I'm outside. And it's a science that anyone can do. So it's really great to do at nature centers, at schools, and even in your backyard. And the great thing is, it's just as important to record data about really common plants as it is about rare plants. So it's a science of plants and animals where we can look at just the common ones that are in our backyard. But it's also important because of the changes that we're starting to see. And so it's a way that we can measure the local impacts of climate change. And what we're really concerned about is what these changes, the impacts are going to have on local species. And for Maryland, it's going to have some big impacts on some of these, our best known state animals. And because of that, it's actually a very easy way to bring up the whole conversation of climate change in a non-confrontational political kind of way. And it's, instead of looking at distant events, I'm really going to focus on the changes that have been measured right here in the kind of DMV area. So my promise is that hopefully at the end of this, you'll have a way to talk to people about climate change. So just to have a quick look at what phenology's meant for people. Basically, humans have been noticing the world around them since we were hunter-gatherers. We had to pay attention to when the plants that we ate emerged, where the animals migrated, and what time. In the Chesapeake Bay area, watermen used to know that when this plant here, which in some parts of the country is known as the serviceberry, but around the Chesapeake Bay is often called the shad bush, that when the shad bush blooms, that's when the shad, the rockfish, run up the river. So it was a way to time when you go, and try and catch your shad running in the rivers. even today, a lot of farmers and gardeners will, use natural cues for when they should do planting. So I really like the really cute one here that you should plant corn when oak leaves are the size of a mouse's ear. So obviously when they first emerge, like over here, they have that kind of fuzzy mouse ear-like appearance. So it helps you remember the little motto of when to plant your corn. So we've been recording, like writing down phenological records since for at least 700 years. In Japan, there are records of when cherry blossoms bloom at different temples. In the West, probably the first person to look at having a long-term record of phenological changes, the founder of kind of phenology, is Robert Marsham here, who was an Englishman who started his records in the early 1700s. He recorded them for 60 years, and his family have continued it for over 200 years. So in Europe, we have really long records of flowering dates. In America, probably the best known person that studied plants and animals was Henry David Thoreau, and we're going to talk about him a lot today. But also Aldo Leopold and his daughter Nina, recorded the dates of the arrival of particularly sandhill cranes over a really long time period. And the guy in the bottom right-hand corner, Billy Barr, has become famous over the last few years. He's kind of called the hermit of the Rockies. And he lived in a hut on his own up in the high mountains since 1973, when he started recording snow depth, the time of first blooming of flowers, and it continues it to this day. So it's a really important record because basically he started his records just as the climate started to change a lot. So his records are this record of the changing climate of the Rockies. And so actually a lot of research on phenology is based in the Rockies because they have his records as a baseline to look at. When we want to decide, compare what happened in the past, we do need historical records of the times that plants leafed out and bloomed. So as I said, one of the oldest long-term records in the US is a very detailed record that Henry David Thoreau kept at Walden Pond. He used to go on a 4-hour walk every day, and he recorded meticulously every plant and animal that he saw on that walk, and what state of reproduction it was in at the time. So it's an incredible amount of data. I just wish I had time to do a 4-hour walk every day to record data. We have numerous sort of snapshots of change from old pictures, particularly of cemeteries, because they're areas that don't get developed. So they have the same trees in living today as, were there 100 years ago. So, you can see the very large change in leaf out that happened at Lowell Cemetery here. But maybe surprisingly, the largest amount of our data actually now is coming from herbarium records. Oops, sorry, I went on using herbarium records of pressed plants. There's literally thousands of collections around, particularly the eastern US, and these are all digitized. Researchers are now using these as the best long-term records that we have of the plants that were growing and the state they were in at different dates when they were collected. So those are our historical records. Today's scientists, have this ability to have a huge, a macro view of what is happening on the East Coast. So pretty much everywhere on the planet has a satellite that goes over and takes a picture every 10 days. So you can monitor the changes that happen in that between each 10-day period by looking at the change in the greenness that he's seeing on the landscape to see the wave of spring coming up the East Coast. Then there's also a national network of phenocams. So it's a camera set high up in the canopy that takes pictures. And this allows, is a lot of the time judging what phenostate a plant is in is kind of subjective. But these pheno cameras, they actually take the green channel and they digitize that image. So they can, they turn the amount of greenness into a number. So you can have this exact comparison from day on day. This is actually the camera from the Cirque research station outside Edgewater. The cameras are all over the nation. So, and all the cameras are accessible every day. This is the image from yesterday that I put in here. So you can look at these cameras to see how, what is the state of, are the leaves changing further north of us? And you can actually look at these cameras around the country. So they provide a lot of information. However, the thing that these pictures, they show the big picture, but from these cameras, you can't tell if it's a maple that's leafing out or an oak tree leafing out. So the vast majority of phenology is actually still boots on the ground, and it's still mostly citizen science, amateur naturalists going out and keeping records. So there's a whole load of different platforms that record this information. You can, follow your particular interest, which is a really cool thing about phenology, because we're interested in everything from the plants to all the different animals. So for looking at plants, there's two different big projects, Nature's Notebook and Budburst. Nature's Notebook is a more kind of strict scientific approach. Project Budburst is easier to use with younger kids, elementary age. But both of them use a protocol. So you learn, how to measure it so that everyone over the country all can agree on what Budburst looks like. So we're all, measuring the same thing. Of course, you might recognize this one is eBird. Birders are some of the most avid users of, inputting data on the arrival and departure of birds. So there's those. And then right at the moment, I know Maryland is in the middle of its breeding bird atlas. I know some of the people who are on tonight are, monitoring for those kind of things. So looking at where birds are breeding and when is all part of monitoring what's happening. So, and the great thing is, especially like Budburst and Notebook, you can just go out and do it on a single day. So you can take a class out or do it at a single visit of a nature center, or you can do it over a long term, so you can measure it every week in your garden. So there's lots of flexibility of what you can do with this monitoring.
Hey Claire, we actually have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is there any way to access the phenocams?
Yeah, they're publicly available. You just go onto the network and the images are all there. I just downloaded that one off the Cirque site, but yeah, you go to the Phenocam network.
Great, and I think Sarah Nell just shared a link to it, so thank you so much. That is it for now.
Yep, great. So anyway, so here we are. This is us now going out to observe some nature, and I've taken us all the way back to spring. So this is a red maple you might recognize, and the buds are just about to burst. So you have to make the decision. Is it leaf buds that are bursting or flower buds? So you can have your guess. If you want to put guesses into the chat box, I can see how you all do.
We are seeing lots of flower answers and then a couple of leaf bud answers.
Yep. Okay, so all the flower people, well done. If you were a little stumped, this one view from looking down at the top kind of helps you out just a little bit. So as they open up, you can see with this male flower, there's this stamen all kind of tightly bundled in there. They look like hot dogs as they're all emerging from a pack. And then once they're out, you'd be able to tell whether you have the male or the female maple. So one of the things that's happened to me since I've been paying attention to phenology, I do the same walk every morning and with my dog, and I now know every red maple tree that I pass, I actually do know which ones are the males and which ones are the females. So it really does work for this paying more attention to the world around me. Let's have some more practices. So over on the extreme right here, this is one of the things that I didn't really do much before I got interested in phenology was really closely study tree flowering. But phenology really, makes you do that. And the flower on the right-hand side is one of the harder ones to spot in the woodlands around us. So if you want to have a guess of what flower you think this is, so like I say, it's a local tree. But so many of these tree flowers are way more attractive than I kind of thought before I started looking at them. So these really pretty red stigma are from the American sycamore. So they're going to turn into those sycamore balls later on in the year. This one in the bottom left with the kind of shaggy ears actually reminds me of Rolf from the Muppets. Those kind of ears hang down. So this one is a female flower on a walnut, so the black walnut. And then this one in the middle, this is the male flower on our local spice bush. So another tree that I learned, hadn't realized before, they're either males or females. And they actually have 9 stamen that's in a circle, and each of the stamen have 2 little anther balls on the end of them. So they're really an attractive flower. So do I have any guesses on this one?
Yeah, everyone who guessed got it right. It's American beech.
Yep, that's right. So it's American beech. These are the male flowers. And the reason that they're really hard to notice is you can see that this one is actually leafing out at the exact same time. So the flowers are really hidden in the leaf there. Makes it hard to spot. Okay, but one of the things I really like about using Nature's Notebook is all of the data that everybody loads up around the country is actually accessible. You can go in and download the data as an Excel file. And so if you're a bit of a data freak like I am, then you can have fun downloading data and plotting it out. So I actually took some data this year. We started a little phenology trail at Benjamin Banneker Park, where I work part-time. And I had monitored the time for leaf out of the pawpaw here. And actually my leaf out times were, so I noticed the leaf out on March 16th this year. And so I wanted to compare it with other local sites. So I actually found the closest site to Baltimore that was recording leaf out for pawpaw was actually in Bethesda. So I was able to pull these dates off, and you can see that in comparison, there's leafed out on March 22nd. So these are the numbered days of the year. Okay, so instead of having to run the dates, you just go January 1st is day 1, day 2, day 3, and then the 1st of February becomes day 32, just so you can easily plot the data. So now if I maintain the phenology trail for a few years, I can track how strong the correlation is between these 2 sites. So if I have a strong correlation that, normally we're 5 days or so earlier on my leaf outs than in Bethesda, then I can use this to backdate the time that, I have leaf out data for at this site. And that's what scientists are doing. They use overlapping records in order to extend the phenological record that we have. Okay, but let's look a bit more just for a minute at the national picture. So what we have here on this slightly complicated picture is we're looking at the leaf out chip we're looking at the change in leaf out times between what we see today and what was recorded in the 1950s. Okay, so if things are leafing out or blooming earlier over the last 10 years than they did in the 50s, then they have these orange and red colors. If things are blooming or leafing out later than they did in the 50s, then they have the blue colors, okay, with the intensity of the color meaning more change. So what's really obvious is a strong pattern here that most of the country, spring is happening earlier, with the exception of the southeast of the country, okay? So it might not be a coincidence that the south of the nation are some of the most climate skeptical people in the country, because if you look at this data, things aren't changing. Their springs are coming later rather than sooner. But one of the things with this data is it's a really cool data set, in that someone with great foresight in the 50s thought what we should do is plant the exact same plants all over the nation, really close to weather stations. And if we use the identical plant over the whole country, then we know that the differences in leaf out and blooming times are due to the differences in weather in those locations, the changes in the cues, and not due to a difference in the species of plant. So that the plants would be identical, they actually use clones. And in the 50s, it seemed like a great idea to use cloned lilac bushes and bush honeysuckle. Okay, so this data comes from lilacs and bush honeysuckles. And it's important to remember that when we look at some of the future data. But just in comparison, I wanted to look at what's happening in spring.
So we actually had a couple questions, Claire, based off of the last map. And in that map, it showed some earlier data, like leaf out earlier in Florida. And we're wondering, how is it different from the rest of the Southeast?
I don't know why Florida has that change. I mean, it is kind of, some parts of Florida have different things. I mean, Florida has a very different climate. Obviously, it's subtropical, these lower parts, and so they don't have any frost and stuff like that. So it's not too surprising that plants react differently living in a place without frost as opposed to in areas where we have a frost. I forgot to point out, actually, while we're back on this chart, that where we are in the DMV, we're at the changeover point. So around us, there's both records where spring's advancing a little, and then records where spring's back falling, is delayed. So we're at the changeover.
So we have two more questions on the map. I'm sorry. The one is just, why are plants blooming later in the South?
Okay, so one of the theories as to why some plants delay is, for some plants, it's really important that they get the cue of having enough cold weather to know when to actually break dormancy. So for some plants, we're pretty sure it's the fact that they don't get enough winter chilling. They're waiting and waiting to have enough winter chilling, and then eventually they just give up and flower because it's like gotten so warm. So that's one of the reasons, but it's also really true that our climate is changing much faster the closer you get to the pole. So the northern parts of the US have experienced more warming than the southern parts. So there is a climatic difference between these areas as well.
It's very interesting. Then the last question is just, where could this information be found? Where could we find the shorts?
Okay, so all this information comes from Nature's Notebook, but these particular two maps, because they show it so nicely, actually came from the US EPA climate change indications. So if you Google US EPA climate change indicators, you will pop up on the page where these maps are available for download.
All right. That is it for now. Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to look at what happened this spring. And probably it's no surprise to anyone that this spring came really early. Okay, we had an exceptionally warm spring, like very warm winter, warm early spring. So in the DMV area up here, we had, almost spring arrived almost 20 days early relative to those 1950s. And whereas actually the north suffered, a cold and delayed spring. So it was a reverse of those patterns. And that's happened the last few years, actually, that I've been looking at the data. Okay, so that's enough looking at the national picture, though, because I really want this talk to focus on the DMV kind of area. So luckily for us, someone did a phenological study that ran the last 30 years of the last century, which was a time period when in our area, we had over 1 degree Celsius of warming. They looked at the records of 100 different plants, and of those, they found that 79 of them had advanced their phenology, with the average being 4.5 days. But what they did find was there was a huge range of variability in how different plants are reacting to the warming. So some plants, are bringing their flowering forward by really big amounts. So then with native trees, a black gum advanced its flowering by 35 days, the red maple by 19. So some of the plants that had like low advances or hardly any advance at all were a lot of our spring ephemerals, like the Dutchman's breeches here that you can see. Although some of them do, like Eastern Columbine, did advance their phenology. But let's look at these two here, hairy bittercress and false strawberry. They have been incredibly flexible in their phenology, and they've advanced their leaf out and flowering by almost, over 40 days. And this means that in the time that I've lived in America, these two weeds have become, some of the most dominant weeds in the early spring period. They come in, when still all the native plants are still, in their winter hibernation. They come in and invade bare ground and lawns. And one of the causes of their success is the fact that, they've been able to advance their phenology and take advantage of this warming. And then at the bottom here, something that's really noticeable is 11 of the plants actually delayed their response. And so, like I said, the thought of this is that, that these are plants that need enough cooling in the winter. So some plants, count the number of warm days, but some plants are counting the number of cold days. And what it tends to be is if you are an early spring leaf out or flowering plant like red maple, then you leaf out so early that you're at risk of a late frost hitting you. And so they tend to have, natural chemicals in that help them survive those frosts. But some plants have much more tender leaves, and so they delay leafing out until they know there's no chance of frost. And to do that, they count the number of cold days. And that's like some of the silver maples and sugar maples do that. They count the cold. And so when winters warm up, they don't have enough cold weather to know when to leaf out, and they actually leaf out later. Some of like the trilliums also are doing that. But this bottom one is really interesting to me. So can you see Japanese honeysuckle also leaves out late, flowers later in this one. So it made me wonder, like what we were looking at before was the bush honeysuckle leafing out later. But in that time period when the South has apparently leafed out later, it might be that if they'd looked at native plants or ones that are more responsive to the early spring flowers, that they would have found more change. Okay, so more work has to be done at trying to properly interpret that lilac and bush honeysuckle data that we have. Okay, so the variability that we just looked at is also reflected when we look at different taxa of animals. So when you actually look at all the different species, amphibians have actually been the most responsive group to climate warming. So on average, amphibians have advanced their spring phenology twice as fast as birds and butterflies and trees have. Okay, so they're really at the forefront of the change. It's also noticeable that butterflies have increased their phenology at twice the rate that herbs, the herbaceous plants have, which is really interesting when you think about the fact that butterflies, are so reliant on finding a particular host plant. So if they're advancing their phenology, and the plants are, then there's a real, risk of butterflies getting out of sync, having a mismatch with the plants that they need for the caterpillars. And studies in Massachusetts have actually shown that there's like massive changes in butterfly populations in the state. They found a lot of butterflies shifting their phenology, really big declines in a lot of their butterflies. So it's an area for a lot of research if you want to look at butterflies.
So we have a couple more questions, Claire.
Yep.
The first is there any similarities in the type of pollination with plants and their delay or advance of flowering? I guess with the butterflies playing in.
Yeah, so it's definitely, actually, we'll get to that slide.
Okay, that sounds good.
Certain groups of plants are reacting more badly. So it's just like, closely related families of plants all are inflexible. So we'll look at that.
Okay, and then the last is just asking if there is an advantage to leafing out early.
So definitely for, a lot of our weedy invasive plants, it means they get this head start on getting a lot of, energy into their leaves, and has allowed them to like grow and dominate areas. So yeah, so especially for weeds it is. Not changing for your phenology is definitely really bad, and we're going to look at that again. We'll come up to that.
All right, great. That is it for now. Thank you.
Okay. So, as I said, we're going to talk about Thoreau quite a bit today because his records have been so extensive. So there's actually the Primark lab up in Massachusetts has looked extensively at the records of Thoreau and lots of other botanists that worked in the Massachusetts area. And they've plotted the change that's been seen in phenology of plants from the 1850s all the way through to what we're seeing today. And what they found was that trees are leafing out, and they change their phenology a lot as the temperatures changed. In comparison, flowers are changing their leaf out dates less as it warms up, and then migratory birds are having the least amount of change in their phenology. So what this means is that back in the 1850s, neotropical migrants coming from Central and South America arrived in Massachusetts before the trees leafed out. But because in the 160 years since then, trees are now leafing out 18 days earlier, the trees now leaf out before the birds arrive. Even though the birds are coming 4 days faster, they haven't kept up with the change in tree leaf out time. And we're going to look at why this is important, but we have to consider different other relationships that are going on with our ecology. So when trees leaf out, trees don't want to get eaten by herbivores, so particularly herbivorous insects, which can defoliate them. So they fill their leaves with noxious chemicals. In the case of these oaks, it's tannins, but it can be cardiac glycosides and anthocyanins and nicotinoids and all kinds of stuff that they put in their leaves to try and stop herbivores eating them. But so herbivores herbivorous caterpillars particularly time their emergence to happen when the leaves emerge, because the baby leaves have got the least amount of those chemicals stored in them, and the chemicals build up through the season. So the largest mass of caterpillars happens right after leaf out. Now, if you imagine you were this like chickadee parent here, and you have a family of baby chickadees that you need to feed. You need to feed them a huge amount of food. They're going to go from hatchling to fledging in just 16 days. It's like if you imagine taking your baby child and feeding them enough food to make them a teenager in just 16 days, how much food you would have to push into your kids. And literally, they pretty much do push in these huge caterpillars to feed them fast enough. And some studies that were done by Brewer, I think it was, in the 1963, he saw that the chickadees were bringing 500, up to 500 caterpillars every day to feed their brood, and that worked out as between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars during those 16 days. So they have to find caterpillars at an amazing rate. They're bringing them every 3 minutes to the nest to feed this hungry brood. Now, these studies have been done, on chickadees because they're in boxes, and we're actually looking at, migratory birds. But they did do a study of the, beautiful blue warbler, and with that one, they found exactly the same, that they were bringing caterpillars every 3 minutes to feed their nestlings. So, what this means is that birds have to nest when that caterpillar mass is at its highest. And lots of studies looked at this, particularly in Europe, because there's so many birders there. And they looked at the fact that the birds were like laying their eggs and having their hatchlings emerge right at the exact moment when those the mass of caterpillars was at its greatest, so they could find food. But unfortunately, because trees are leafing out earlier, what's happened is that the timing of the maximum number of caterpillars has also moved forward. And that's caused this thing called the mismatch, where, when the fledglings need their food, the amount of caterpillars available has already declined. And in Europe, they've seen really big declines in certain species of their birds because of this mismatch. But in America, we actually have a slightly more complicated situation because of the way the country lays out. So there's a lot more north-south movement of our birds. So we actually have two types of migrant birds, the short distance and the long distance migrants. So short distance, are like red-winged blackbirds and the white-throated sparrows and robins. And a lot of these birds, because we've been having warmer winters, they've actually shifted their, in the winter, they don't fly as far south. So their winter range has shifted north by an average of 40 miles. So because of that, they were able to travel and get to their their summer breeding areas sooner in the year, because they're traveling less distance. So on average, they're flying 3%, less far to get to their breeding grounds. So for instance, in Maine, bluebirds over the last 50 years have started arriving 3 weeks earlier to nest. But in comparison, our long distance migrants, the ones that are traveling all the way from South America, like this beautiful cerulean warbler. So I'm trying to speak too fast. So, yeah, so they are traveling a lot further, and the cues that tell these migrants to leave aren't the same. So in this tropical area, climate isn't changing as fast. There hasn't been as much warming. So they're not getting the cues to leave as early. And then when they travel if they arrive in an area and the leaf out has already started to happen, they're actually going to continue flying north to get to the right area to nest. So what we're seeing with a neotropical migrants, the long distance migrants, is that they're traveling up to 8% further. So they're having to shift to a more northerly ground area. And in this particular case, the cerulean warbler, Maryland is actually the southernmost area that it breeds. Wrong way. So their range shifts north as it's predicted to, then the areas that are going to be lost are actually this area, the northern parts of Maryland. They won't be breeding, they'll be moving further north. And we're going to lose this bird for breeding in Maryland. A very similar thing could happen to our state bird, Baltimore Oriole. So at the moment, this is the current range with nesting in Maryland. But if we take the predictions for the weather for 2080, in order to keep up with the change in those leaf out times, they're going to shift north, and we're actually maybe going to need a new state bird if we want one that breeds in the state. In actual fact, that the predictions for the state butterfly are the exact same. The Baltimore checker spot, we think it's going to move its range north out of Maryland. But some birds, have more flexible regimes. There's a lot of monitoring of hummingbirds, and they tend to progress northwards with, following blooms. And of course, they're not reliant anywhere near as much on caterpillars. They catch flying insects to feed their young. And so they've successfully advanced their phenology. And they used to arrive here in the DMV May 1st, and actually today we're seeing them arrive as early as April 23rd, so 7 or 8 days advance in their arrival. Overall, with birds, the picture is really variable. Some birds, doing really well. Some birds not doing so well. Some birds aren't able to shift their phenology, and that's where these 9 birds that are in trouble because they haven't shown the ability to shift. Okay, so if you've stayed with me this far, you're probably going, oh my gosh, Claire, you're giving a talk and you haven't talked about bees. So here we go, we're going to talk about bees. So the relationship between bees and flowers. If flowers are flowering earlier in the season, we need to know if bees are also emerging sooner. So there's been very limited study because compared to birding, which is why I talked it for so long, not many people look at bees. But the one study that has been done, 10 bees that they looked at, and of course we have over 450 here in Maryland, but the 10 bees they looked at, they were emerging about 10 days earlier, the same amount as the flowers were coming out earlier. So that was the good news. But the bad news was they were looking at generalist bees, kind of bees that will just go to any old flower, we don't care. But the most at risk animals are always going to be like the specialists, like this specialist spring beauty bee that only collects pollen from the spring beauty flowers. You can see covered in all the pink pollen down there. So they only collect spring beauty pollen. So at the moment, we think it's tracking the earlier blooming, but there's more problems. So one of the things is that spring ephemerals come out really early in the year before trees leaf out because they need the energy from sunlight coming down. And what we've discovered is that we've already seen that trees are leafing out more quickly, changing their phenology more quickly than the flowers are. In fact, by twice as much. So the trees are now leafing out about 2 weeks earlier, plants are only about a week earlier, and so the flowers are actually getting about 7 days less sunlight on them, which has been a decline since Thoreau's time of about 25% less energy that they get. And for the rest of this century, that could decline another 10 to 50%. So for a lot of these flowers, the problem's going to be a shortage of energy, and most of them run with like this incredibly limited amount of sunlight that they get each year. This is our beautiful trout lily, which only gets enough energy to flower once every 7 years, and this is its specialist bee, the trout lily bee, really cute little guy. And then the other impact that's happening in the woodlands is, if you've ever taken a walk in our woodlands, they've been overtaken by invasives, about 40% of the plants. And there's been a study recently of the flower leafing out of invasive and native shrubs. And what they found was the further south you go, the earlier that the invasives leaf out. Our latitude, about 39 degrees, whatever here. The invasives leaf out about 30 days before, Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, are leafing out before like spicebush and flowering dogwoods and native ones. So they're also increasing the shade effect on the native plants. And you can see this if you go walking in the woods in the early spring. It's easy to see that everything green at a certain time is invasive. And particularly for the spring ephemerals, the one that's leafing out the first of the spring ephemerals is this, the lesser celandine that just carpets our woodlands. So it has this huge advantage because it leaves out first and can collect more energy. And we brought thousands, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. We brought thousands of different plants to the Americas, on purpose or accidentally. And most of them don't become invasive, but the ones that do, one of the reasons is that they tend to have very flexible, it's called plastic phenology. They can easily change the times that they leaf out and flower to take advantage of the changing climate. And so climate change is really advantageous to a lot of these plants. In comparison, unfortunately, they did a study of all the plants that were monitored by Thoreau in the 1850s, and the plants that are still present in the area around Concord. And what they were really shocked to discover was about 50% of the plants that Thoreau saw have either no longer exist in the Concord area or have drastically declined, have gone from being common to extremely rare. For instance, there were 21 species of orchids that Thoreau monitored, and only 6 of them are still present in that area. And what they discovered was that the plants that have declined are the ones that can't change their phenology. And it tends to be, there's like a lot of the asters, a lot of mints, orchids, lilies, and anemones. All of these plants have really declined because those are the ones whose phenology doesn't change. Whereas in comparison, ones that have changed their phenology, so like the blueberry here, is now flowering 2 to 3 weeks earlier than Thoreau noticed it, and they've become more prevalent. And they compared this against, Concord is an area that's actually been really protected. More than 50% of the land there is in like parks or undeveloped. But they did look at the other factors, and being able to not change your phenology was more correlated with decline even than with other factors such as the increasing deer that's happened in that area of Massachusetts, just like here, since the time of Thoreau. They did have to also consider, the fact that the Concord area in the suburbs of Boston, has the impacts of urbanization. So in urban areas, temperatures are rising much more quickly. They've seen about 2 degrees C of warming compared to the 1 degree C in non-urban areas, with the impact particularly happening in winter. So it's kind of funny actually, because you can see what's going to happen to plants, how they'll change their phenology by studying what's happening in cities. So it's like looking at what will the world be like for these plants once the world is another degree warmer than it is currently. But there is a slight complicating factor that plants are also affected by light pollution. Just one more reason to deal with light pollution is the fact that it makes them think the days are longer. it's light when it shouldn't be light. And you can actually see this. Sometimes if you look in a town, you can find trees that are right next to a bright light, and they side next to the light, they change, the leaf color changes later and the leaves drop later. So next time you're in the city this fall, have a look for that happening. Oop, I'm going the wrong way all the time on my thing. Here we go. So just to wrap up, we can use all this information that we found out about phenology to decide, we can see which plants are most vulnerable to future climate change, the ones that aren't able to change their phenology. I've noticed a massive decline in wild ginger in the state parks near me since I've lived here. I kind of just thought it was the impacts of lesser celandine, but also wild ginger is not changing its phenology, which is probably, a part of that decline. And once we realize which plants are most at risk from climate change, it means we can focus monitoring on those and decide, if we want to take future actions like assisted migration for these plants and animals that are most at risk. We know that like birds are going to have to migrate further. So things like, the work of Dr. Doug Tallaney, trying to improve habitat for birds by planting natives, is really important. They need more energy because they've got to fly further. We're able to, people discovered that using phenology is the best way to decide when to spray, to treat different pests, by using the close link between, when something's blooming and when pests emerge. It means you can minimize the use of pesticides by treating the pest when it's at its most sensitive to that pesticide and prevent having to do reapplication, so reducing that pesticide use. We also, some people, it always is about the money, and changing phenology is having huge economic costs, particularly for farmers. So cherry trees and peach trees are starting to bloom earlier because of the changing phenology. And so they bloom, but then get caught by what would normally be the normal time for a late frost. And this is caused massive amounts of crop loss in Georgia and Michigan and stuff. So there's definitely that economic cost, plus like tourist attractions like the Cherry Blossom Festival and Tulip Festivals are all having to change their timing as everything blooms earlier. And finally, Sarah Tangren at the University of Maryland Extension, she has produced these maps of where we might need to source plants from if you want to plant a tree now, so that it will be happy with the climate that we have in the Maryland area by 2100. So if we have really low emissions, then we'll be looking to get plants that are happy to live in Virginia. But if we have really high emissions, then we're looking at the Carolinas, in even like Georgia. But another thing we could actually look at is if you plant plants that have flexible phenologies, then they can change their phenology and they can be successful and still happy living in Maryland. Whereas if we know a plant can't change its phenology, those are the ones that aren't going to be successful landscaping plants. But you can always help it out. So you could, if you want to plant spring ephemerals, plant it under one of those trees that's not changing its leaf out time, because then it's still going to get the sunlight that it needs. Okay, so what is going to happen in the future? Well, we're able to cut twigs from trees and then use forcing techniques in greenhouses under different climate conditions of what future winters and future springs might be. And when they've done this, by the end of the century, red maples with low emissions could be blooming 10 to 12 days earlier, but with those highest emissions, it's 32 to 40 days. And so what's really important message to take away from this is that the slower we can make change happen, the better chance plants have got to adapt. So imagine this poor snow hare, okay? A snow hare has to change its coat completely from brown to white at just the right time when snow is on the ground. If it gets it wrong, the ecological costs for hares are really bad. There's an 80% predation rate on hares that are the wrong color. But they can change. They've shown that within 10 generations, the hares are able to shift the timing of when they change their coat. So if we can slow the change that's going to happen, we know it's going to happen, but if we can change it, slow it down, we're going to give these animals and plants the time that they need, you know, to actually change. And so that's the message that's really important to take to everyone about climate change, is all actions are important, because every little bit is going to slow down, you know, how fast our climate changes. And so that's the vital thing for our wildlife. Okay, autumn, the forgotten season. Oh my gosh, we're at the end of the talk and I totally forgot to talk about autumn. Like, nobody looks at autumn. It's like the season that no one looks at. And that's because it's really hard to monitor. Everybody knows like when a plant leaves out, but it's really hard to judge when the leaves are falling. Is it the first leaf, the last leaf? It's just really tough. Plus, what we've discovered is that how plants respond to fall is really complicated. So on this map, this is like spring leaf out. Spring leaf out, you can account for the variability of it. 75% of that variability is dependent on temperatures. But for leaf fall, only 20% is dependent on, 20 to 50% here is dependent on the actual temperatures. So summer conditions, like did it rain lots, did we have long droughts, you know, change when trees lose their leaves. But because of that, there's lots and lots of potential for doing research in the fall. So go outside. This is my yard this week. I've got goldenrods in all different stages of budding. So even at this time of year, you know, there's still lots of data to collect on what plants are blooming any particular week. And with that, another picture of Bee, because I'm finished. I did actually, because I know she's on today, I wanted to say thank you to Kerry Wickstead, because I totally wouldn't be talking about phenology if it wasn't for Kerry encouraging me to develop this phenology talk. Because of Project Wild training, where we take the idea of phenology and make it into a class that educators can take to, you know, take their kids out to teach them about plants and learn about phenology. So if you want to learn about phenology and doing it with kids, just contact Kerry about some Project Wild training. And with that, I'm finished. Whew, did I stay on time? 8 o'clock.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, talking faster and faster at the end there. There's all those questions.
There are some questions too, if we do want to answer some. And now it's the end. I do have to share my screen real quick to get advertising for the next ones. All right.
Thank you, Bradley.
So I'm just gonna share with you some our last questions that have come through towards the end. So first off, why are some plants able to change phenology better than others?
So it's just, you know, how they respond to cues. And so it gets, you know, there's a lot of research looking at it. But I have to admit, you know, for me, it's more interesting to know, you know, which groups of plants are able to change and which ones can't, then going into the, you know, it gets quite looking at the deep biology and the chemistry, you know, biochemical reactions happening into plants as to why some change and others don't. A lot of it tends to be the history of the plant. If it's a plant that has come from more tropical areas, then often, you know, they just don't have as much flexibility as plants that have always lived in more temperate areas. And then it's also, like I said, whether they are frost tender or not. So frost tender plants careful of those leaves and they don't want to leaf out too soon.
I see. Would you say that the majority of plants are able to change their phenology, or is it the minority of them?
Well, so of that, plants around here, the ones that I've looked at most. So in that 100 plants that they looked at, the native plants, so 79 of them did change some. So yeah, it seems like the majority of plants can change, just some of them can't change fast enough for how fast our climate is now changing.
Right. And the next was kind of based on observation of butterflies this year. They seem to be very sparse and arrived very late. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
Yeah, so one of the things I think has happened with our butterflies is that last year was the biggest butterfly year since certainly I've been living in the US, like 20 years. And if you remember like your basic ecology lessons, there's these things of like snow hares and lynx, and the number of snow hares goes up in this big loop up. And because there's more snow hares, the number of lynx go up, and so they eat all the snow hares, so then the population of snow hares crashes. So if we apply those same principles to butterflies, when you have a really boom year for butterflies, it means a lot of predators and diseases of those butterflies can build up. So certainly some of it I think is just a natural rebalance as the high numbers of predatory insects and diseases built up last year. But it was also a really weird spring. We had a very warm period that might have brought some of the insects, the butterflies, out of hibernation, and then we had a late frost. I mean, it wasn't late by historic standards, it was just late because it'd already been so warm that a lot of insects were already come out of hibernation.
Right. Okay. We have one more. This is much more big picture question. Policy-wise, it is just asking about if our national leadership is dismantling the policies that are trying to slow climate change. What is there that we can do to help? Yeah.
So it's also talk to people. It's hard having conversations about climate change because it becomes so political, but talking about the changes that you're seeing around in your yard and raising the topic by talking about how we don't get as much snow as we used to when I was a kid, that plants are changing. I read this really interesting article, I watched this really interesting talk about how phenology is showing that the climate is impacting plants and animals. We could lose animals like Baltimore Orioles from Maryland. It's a way of trying to raise the topic with people and talk to them, and try and change public opinion about that this is an important topic. And then obviously, personal actions that will reduce your carbon footprint.
Right. Well, thank you so much. That is our last question. And thanks again for such a wonderful presentation.
Okay. Whew, just stayed on time.
Thank you, Claire. That was awesome. I would like the audience to join me in congratulating you for a fascinating talk.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thanks.